Greetings to everyone. My name is Prasad Bidaye. I'm a professor at Humber Polytech in Toronto, Canada. I'm speaking to you today from my home in Milton, Ontario, Canada. Milton is a small town just outside Toronto. I often equate it to the example of Thane or Navi Mumbai, just outside of the main city that is Mumbai. Uh, I'm very honored to be present, although virtually, with all of you today. And I'm grateful to my dear friends and colleagues, Harish Mehta and Julie Banerjee Mehta, both for inviting me, encouraging me to participate in this conference today on bilateral Canadian and Indian relations. Uh, my experience itself is probably a great place, to think about, the experience of someone like myself, when it comes to thinking about Indian and Canadian relations, because in many ways I'm a product of all that. I was asked to speak about my identity, so I'll give some background. Um, I consider myself the child of immigrants, and though I'm over half a century, old, I still consider myself. I'll use that word child for just to kind of theorize this a little bit. My parents, they were born and raised in Maharashtra, India. My mother was born and raised in Mumbai, or the city that was formerly called Bombay. My father grew up in the area of Konkan, specifically the town called Devgad, right close to, just a few hours away from the Goa border, and also known for its what we call hapus, but also known as Alfonso mangoes. My parents, my well, this coming in this spring marks my father's 60th anniversary of being in Canada, so of immigrating to Canada. So I'm the second generation of that, and I'm also a parent to children who are part of this immigrant story. Um, there are lots of ways to talk about the experience of people like us, who were born and raised here. Whether we were born here or immigrated here as young children. And I'm going to walk through this by talking about a couple of stereotypes. The first stereotype is that, by being raised here, we we have lost our culture. We have lost our parents' Indian culture. That is the first stereotype. There's complete loss, and instead there's complete assimilation into what's called Canadian culture or American culture or Western culture or whatever that is. This is a stereotype, and it doesn't, it's a stereotype. The other stereotype is that these children grow up between two worlds, and there's Indian culture at home, some form of Indian culture at home, and then there's some form of American culture, or Canadian culture rather, sorry, Canadian culture at schools. And this is the stereotype of and I said America because there's an American name for the stereotype, and that is the American born confused Daisy, right? ABCD, American born confused Daisy, with the emphasis on the word confusion. Um, and that's more of a tragic stereotype. The optimistic stereotype is the person, who has, born and raised with these different cultural influences, and who has arguably found the best of both worlds. And which is a great way of looking at things. I want to say that none of these stereotypes apply to me, neither the negative ones nor the positive ones. None of them apply to my personal experience. For me, there is no best of both worlds. There's only one world, and that's the world of planet Earth. Um, and, and so the question that I often get is, well, what does that actually mean, to be a world citizen? And I think, I've been very lucky, and I give full credit to my parents for this, and that is, for me, India, and I'll speak about India, first. India has always been real, and I make this distinction because for many people I know, India has not been real. It's been mythical, and it's been mediated. India is known through a combination of narratives that come to people, often through Hindi cinema, Bollywood, and then often through cultural learning, cultural education, through temples, mosques, gurdwaras, and other kinds of cultural heritage sites like that. And in those cases, in those contexts, India is often mythologized. But I was very fortunate. India was has always been real to me, and part of that has to do with I was lucky that I made visits to India as a child. Although in my case, I didn't make frequent visits, but I often spent long visits. And one of the longest visits I made was when I was 7 years old, and I spent 4 months in India because my parents wanted us to make sure that we meet our grandparents. Um, but it was also through a different type of pop culture, and that was literature. And I work in English now in literary studies, but it was through this the phenomenon of Amar Chitra comic books. I read these when I was in India as a little boy, and when I visited India, and I continued to read these comic books growing up, where I learned about what I would call the real India, both in terms of whether it be you know ancient mythologies or and legends and stories, folk tales, but then also learning about pre-colonial and colonial and anti-colonial historical movements. So and that was a big part of so that made India real in the sense of not mythical, not a place of just timeless traditions, but a place where there's history and things were always changing. I was also very fortunate that I grew up with as the son of Raya Bidaye, who is a harmonium player, and in this part of the world, considered to be among the top three harmonium players, working in classical Indian music. Uh, he was also a pioneer in Ragmala. Ragmala is an organization that promoted classical Indian music in Toronto. So my father was organizing concerts, both for classical music, but then also for contemporary Marathi music. And I was very much exposed to these artists, and I was able to meet these artists growing up and see them perform live and get a sense of what, as someone who grew up to then, you know, find a place in contemporary arts. I got to see what contemporary arts looks like in India, but by living here. And the best part about it was these are experiences that most of my family in India did not have firsthand. Being able to watch the late great Ustad Zakir Hussain perform live just a couple of feet away from oneself, or any of these great musicians, whether it be Zakir Hussain, Pandit Hari Prasad Chaurasia, Pandit Shiv Kumar Sharma, any of these musicians we got to see in very close proximity, to interact with them, and to see what they were like. And these are things that I would not have had so easily growing up. Yeah, I was able to I had these experiences growing up in diaspora as opposed to, on the subcontinent back home. And one of the other things I want to add is also that growing up here is that that I got exposed to Indian literature, or I should put it this way: I learned about Indian literature. I learned about India through literature. That's what I'm trying to say. I learned about India through literature, English literature, and also through films. Through the works of Ali Kazemi, who did an important documentary on the Narmada River movement in the 1990s, and also Rohinthan Mistry, who's based in Toronto. So all these things made India very real. At the same time, there's a bit of a paradox here, and that is that being in Canada, I'm not really Indian anymore. I'm obviously not Indian by citizenship. Instead, based on government census documents and data collection, I'm South Asian, and it's a concept that's both problematic but then also beneficial. I'm South Asian, and that means that I'm part of a community. I'm part of a demographic that is subcontinental. It includes India, Pakistan, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Nepalis, and so on and so forth. Um, and the beauty of all of that is that we are all people who have been put into a category, but by being in this category, we are able to actually connect with each other. And we've done that through so many different ways, including the arts. For example, the Ragmala that I meant, music society that I just mentioned. Um, we had an organization here in the 1990s about art and activism. called Desh Pradesh, which again brought all those young people from all those different backgrounds together, but then we also had a strong queer focus, an LGBTQ focus, and also a strong activist focus. When I did my PhD in, and this is probably the best example I can give, but I did my PhD in English and South Asian studies. My supervisor was the late Chelva Kanaganayakam. So I was working with a Sri Lankan literary scholar, being from diaspora, being based here in Toronto, grown up here in Toronto, while reading about South Asia in English. And so there's lots of words to describe these kinds of experiences. There's words like, hybrid, transnational, deterritorial. In my own work that I do with this the collective IR Indigenous Resistance, we use the word outer national, which is, and I don't have enough time to explain all of these concepts, but they all more or less, are relevant. But the bottom line for all these is that they had to do with relationships, the relationships that we build with people, in spite of geography, in spite of political differences, political boundaries, and often in spite of in defiance of social boundaries and any boundaries that are considered taboo, including the one that puts us into this category of being South Asian. Uh, because I've been called South Asian, I also call myself a North American because I have so much closeness to America at the same time too. Closeness meaning not to the government, but to people, to friends, to family, and just by the fact that I'm 2 hours away from the American border as well too. So the bottom line for me is all about relationships: personal, cultural, social, academic, literary, artistic, activistic. So I end on closing that note, and encourage everyone to think about the importance of relationships, in this work that we're all doing when thinking about, in today's case, bilateral Canadian and Indian relationships. Okay, many thanks for listening to me today, and I wish all the best for your conference. Take care. Bye bye.